be private information. It was treated that way by the telcos. The problem, of course, is that some governments, American included, the intelligence community and the law enforcement community had the right to demand information under certain conditions, specifically court orders. And without going through all the details, there's been some erosion of the court order part, at least in the U.S., and that's raised a great many concerns. But I think we need to distinguish between governments abusing access to personal information and the private sector having access to and potentially abusing personal information. I don't think those two are the same. They don't pose the same kind of threat. In the case of the commercial world, the important thing is that companies recognize when they have personal information or private information and take steps to protect it and take steps to make sure that the users know what information is it that's being accumulated and for what purpose. So Google has worked very hard to create a dashboard to help people know what information is accumulated and what we do with it. We still have work to do there. I think we need to make it even more transparent than it is today. We also, working on the other side of it, have been publishing what we call the transparency report, so people can see what governments around the world have, what demands governments around the world have made of Google about personal information. And so we're trying very hard to make this as transparent as possible, but it's still a work in progress. The thing I also want to emphasize, though, is that we are our own worst enemies when it comes to the loss of privacy in the internet. To give you a simple example, let's imagine that you have gone to, let's say you've gone to Egypt. Well, maybe right now might not be a good idea, but let's imagine at some point you did that. And you're standing in front of the pyramids, and you'd like to have a photograph of yourself in front of the pyramids. So you ask somebody that you don't know to take a picture. And I just happen to be near enough to be caught in the image. Okay, fine. So you upload this. You don't know who I am. You don't know who the picture taker is. You upload the image, and somebody else is crawling around looking for pictures of pyramids, and they find your picture, and they see me, and they happen to know who I am. And so they tag me. Okay, so now somebody else who's crawling around looking for pictures of Vint Cerf discovers a picture of me standing in front of the pyramids next to you at a certain date and time. Except I had told them that I was somewhere else at the time. So now I'm in trouble because of a picture that you asked somebody to take that you posted. Now this is, a made-up example. The reason it's important for you to think about, though, is that this is an example of an innocent set of actions which led to a problem for me, which you didn't intend. Our intuitions about the social effects of our use of our technologies is still immature. I am, let me say, optimistic that we will evolve social conventions for dealing with this as we have in other situations. There are things that you just don't do in public, for example, or you don't do face-to-face or what have you, because it's just considered socially inappropriate. Some people still do those things, and either we think of them as jerks, or sometimes we actually think of them as lawbreakers, because I'm sorry, you can't do that in public, there will be consequences. So we adopt social conventions for convenience. And to show you a very trivial example, when you're walking down the street, opposite somebody else, usually in most cultures you just get out of the way. But you can imagine a kind of silly practice where you stand in front of each other and you dare the other person to get out of the way first. We don't do that because it's inconvenient. So social conventions that make life a little more fluid and comfortable are not uncommon. It's just that we haven't evolved them yet for the online environment. And it's a task that we all face.
We have a lot of entrepreneurs in the room that use the internet to build businesses, and we are in South Africa, the continent of Africa. Internet has had a huge impact on the continent, but I think we're all a little bit disappointed in the growth of internet in Africa, and I want to have your thoughts about what do you think about the role of private industry, about government. You said earlier the ARPANET would never have happened without the support of the DoD in the US. So how do you feel about what can we do here? How can we increase the speed of adoption of the internet in Africa?
So you've asked a question that has just an enormous number of facets to it. Let me try to go through a few of them. The first one is that government investment in research is actually very important. For one thing, governments can tax. They can assemble a fairly substantial amount of money, and they get to decide how to spend it. Sometimes we don't agree with what they've chosen, but what's important is that if you have a really hard research problem that no business would ever go after because it's too risky, the government can actually afford to do that. And that's what ARPA does. And it's not the only agency in the United States that does this. The National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, NASA, and so on, all have R&D programs, and they are all frequently aimed at pretty hard problems. The government can afford to continue to support research if it appears to be productive. The networking research support from ARPA went from 1969 to 1990. The research support from the National Science Foundation went from approximately 1982 to 1995. These are long-term investments. The thing that was really important is that the results of the investment were very, very rapidly translated into the academic sector because a lot of the research was being done by academics. So people moving through universities who were interested in this stuff actually got trained in the early stages of internet development to figure out how to build a router, how to write a TCP end-to-end, how to build applications on top of all that. Then they moved out into industry. And I remember around 1992, there were people graduating from universities in the United States who had access to email from NSF in particular. And they would get into the companies and they would say, "Where's my email?" And of course there wasn't any. And the companies were forced to adopt email because their new hires were saying, "I want my email. I can't do my work without being able to interact with my colleagues." So people started putting email addresses on their business cards and would apologize in 1992 if they didn't have an email address on their business card. So this ability to transfer technology is very, very important. And it happens, the word technology transfer is an oxymoron. Technology does not transfer itself. What transfers are products that people can use and people. And the basic engine for technology transfer in the world I've lived in has been people going from the research environment into business. And sometimes we have this happen inside of our own company where somebody who has invented something ends up being responsible for turning it into a product and then turning it into a business. So that part's really important. Now I want to pick off a few specific things traps that we need to be aware of. In Sweden, the last figure I heard was that 4.4% of their GDP goes into R&D. This is a really big percentage. The question is, what has happened? And when I was visiting there, we were asking ourselves, well, are there a lot of small and medium-sized businesses started in Sweden? The answer is yes. And a lot of them get started because of R&D that happened in either an academic setting or R&D from some corporate setting. The question is, how many of those startups grew? And the answer is not very many. They didn't have Ericsson's and Saab's and other kinds of really big businesses growing out of all these little startups. They had lots of startups. They had some big businesses, but not a steady growth of small business to big. So the question was, why is that? All that R&D, all the innovation and everything else was there, good quality people coming out of, well-educated people out of universities. So when we bored into this, we discovered a reason, not necessarily the only one, that there was a problem. It turns out in Sweden, if you start a company and you are the CEO and the company fails, you are personally liable for the debts of the company. Now, most CEOs tend to be very conservative when it comes to investments because they don't want to lose their personal wealth in consequence of a corporate failure. Now, I believe that needs to change. I hope that the Swedish government creates the kind of limited liability arrangement that is common elsewhere. So that's an important lesson to learn, that you need to have the right ecosystem with the right parameters in place in order to make R&D and innovation turn into business. And that's an example of a case that didn't happen. Now there's another problem that shows up that's related to this. Every once in a while, we will have visitors coming to the Silicon Valley saying, I want to turn X, for some value of X, into Silicon Valley. And one day, several years ago, Tony Blair, while he was still Prime Minister, showed up. And John Chambers, the CEO of Cisco, invited about 10 of us to come and have lunch with the Prime Minister. And first, after Tony talked about the importance of education, which I hope we all agree with, and maybe we'll come back to that, Then he asked the question, how do I turn London into Silicon Valley? And there was dead silence. And I'm sitting here feeling really embarrassed because, oh my God, the Prime Minister just asked a question. You can't just sit there. So I said, well, maybe we could explain to the Prime Minister what it was about the Silicon Valley environment that enabled us to be successful. And so Steve Jobs raised his hand, and, which is unusual for Steve. Normally he wouldn't bother raising his hand, but he raised his hand. And so I called him Steve, and he said, well, one thing we all have in common here is that we've all failed at one time or another, and I'm sure he was thinking about Next, which was, a brave but not totally successful business, except he sold it to Apple, and that worked out really well. And his point was that it didn't leave him with the mark of Cain on his forehead. He was still, that was considered a mark of experience in the Silicon Valley. Now, if you fail all the time, that's a different story. But the idea that failure is experience is incredibly important. I can't emphasize this enough. The first business that you start may not succeed, but you better learn something from that if it doesn't. I mean, don't keep making the same mistakes. Esther Dyson says, keep making different mistakes. That's good advice. So the idea that a business failure is a learning experience is actually important. And in the Silicon Valley, it's treated as, it's important to know how things can fail, how you can detect that you might be on the wrong road, how you might actually be able to respond to that. So experience is really, really important. So I don't want you, as you have aspirations to start new businesses, to be discouraged if the first business doesn't work. Now the problem here is that the other parts of the environment, ecosystem, including funding, has to also have the same attitude, because if they see your business has failed, then they don't want to lend you any more money, because obviously you don't know how to run a business. And even if that might have been true, it's not necessarily true that you don't know how to run the next one. So it's really important to get the venture capital funding apparatus tolerant of failures in the face of treating that as experience. And this is an area where I'm pretty sure that South Africa needs some work. The same is true, by the way, in Europe. They have exactly the same problem.
So, I mean, that's something that comes up quite often